In this series of lectures, let's talk about exceptions. It's a very it's quite a major topic in the Java programming language. Now, before we talk about exceptions, let's look at an example of how methods can can notify the caller that a problem has occurred. Now, some people still do this in the older languages such as C, okay, which does not have this feature of exceptions. So look at this method called enter into database, okay, of the class demo. Now, basically, it takes in information about a user, his ID, his name, his age, all right, and tries to enter this user into a particular user database. And the question is, why does it return an int? All right. Now, the return value, which is a number, tells the caller of this method the status of this entry. If 0 is returned, that means successful. The user has been successfully entered into a DB. If it's -1, that means there's something wrong, the ID and name passed in. If it's -2, there's an error due to the age. The age has to be 21 and above before he can be entered into the database. So in the method, you can have code which checks the input parameters and which returns -1 or -2 if there's a problem with the input parameters. Otherwise, go on and perform the steps to enter the stuff into the database, and at the end you return a 0 to indicate to the caller of this method or the invoker of this method that success, the user has been successfully entered into a database. Now this is a very coarse way, a very rough way to inform a caller of a method that something has gone wrong or something has successfully completed. In this case, it is quite fine, but look at the disadvantages. Number one, the caller needs to know what the return codes mean. Okay, -1 means this, -2 means this, -3 means that. It is an arbitrary relationship between a number and an error condition. Okay, number two, what if this method returns a number? For example, this method may be product, and you take in two number and returns the product of the two numbers. How do you flag an error? Because you have to return a number, and the error code may be one of the possible answers which is returned. All right, so that's a huge disadvantage because a method can only return one value. Remember that. So let's talk about exceptions. Now, an exception happens to indicate that something has gone wrong. When you call a method and something goes wrong in that method, it can throw an exception to you. You are the caller of the method. Alright, so it's a different paradigm compared to how we wrote enter into database in a demo class. Alright, I'm going to show you how we can use exceptions to rewrite this method. Now there are 5 keywords, alright, in Java which is related to exceptions. We are going to look at the first 3 very soon: try, catch, and finally. We look at throws and throw soon as well in one of the subsequent lectures. Now, so this test class, this main method, basically uses the demo class which we have just written. Alright, just seen. I call it enter into database method, and the result is then stored into status, which is an int, and I can display an error message, or if display a success message depending on the value of the status. This is the old way of doing things. Okay, let me cut some code which I've written. Okay, I'm going to replace the same method, same name. So what's the difference between enter into database now and the previous one? First thing, it does not have to return an error code. It may return whatever it needs to return, but in this case, it returns nothing. But of course, if your method needs to return something, please show the return value there. Look at this part. Alright, This part in the method signature tells the caller of this method, okay, that I may throw back to you an invalid parameter exception. If something goes wrong, if the input parameters which you have passed over to me are invalid, I'm going to throw an exception back to you. This exception is called an invalid parameter exception. Okay? And same thing, I check the validity of the input parameters. Look at this statement here. This statement basically creates the exception and throws it to the caller of the method. If nothing goes wrong, the user is entered into the database, the method returns. So how should tests be changed? How should the main method be changed? Let me copy this stuff and paste it here. Okay, so a new code will look something like this. There's a try block here. Alright, starts with a curly brace, ends with a curly brace. So this is a block. We call this the try block. We put a statement, the statement which calls the enter into database method into the try block. The try block can contain multiple statements. Alright. In this example, only one statement is in the try block, but it can contain multiple statements. And there is a catch block, which starts from here and ends here. A catch block. So as the name implies, the catch block is supposed to catch an exception. You just think of an exception as a ball, you know. So when the main method starts, it creates a new demo object. It goes into the try block, runs line 6, calls the enter into database method. So if something goes wrong with the input parameters, this statement, line 6, will result in an exception, an invalid para exception, being thrown back to the try block, and you'll be caught here. And line 9 will run. Okay, on line 9, I'm going to print out error followed by a string, okay, which is obtained by calling the getMessage method of the exception object. Isn't this cleaner? If nothing goes wrong on line 6, the catch block, this catch block will be totally, bypassed, and the program will carry on running. Okay, if there are subsequent lines here. So that is how we use exceptions in Java. You call a method, the method does its job. If a problem occurs, it may throw an exception back to the caller, and the caller may want to catch the exception and do whatever we want with the error with the exception. So in this example, the error message is just printed, but it can be anything. You can log the error, you can terminate a program if you want to, although that's not commonly done. You can show an error message. It's up to you what you want to do. No error codes involved. Alright? So, how does this work? Now this is a try block. We can have a catch block for... I'm going to give you another example. And this example has got to do with converting. You can have statements here. Statement 1. Statement 2. Statement 3. Now I was saying that I'm going to give you another example which has got to do with converting a string into an integer. But before that, let's try to understand this again. Let's try to understand the flow. Statement 4. Statement 5. Statement 0. Okay, so this chunk of code you have just written can be found in any method. When the method runs, okay, I run this, it's number 1. I go into the try block, I run statement 2. Now let's assume in this scenario, nothing goes wrong with statement 1, statement 2, and statement 3. So after statement 1, I'll go to statement 2. I'll go to statement 3, nothing goes wrong. Since nothing goes wrong, the catch block will be totally ignored. And after statement 3, I'll move on to statement 5 and any other subsequent statements. So this black ink shows the sequence of statements which will run when none of the statements in a try block causes an exception. I'm going to change the color of my pen to indigo. Alright, and I'm going to show you what happens if an exception occurs. Let's assume that an exception occurs in statement 2. Okay, so when this code runs, well, this ink looks like blue. Alright, statement 0 will execute. I'll go to a try block. Statement 1 will execute. Statement 2 will execute. Okay, let's assume an exception occurs in statement 2. When an exception occurs in a try block, all the subsequent statements after the statement which has caused the exception to be skipped. And of course, it makes good sense for that to for them to be skipped because the subsequent statements may have assumed that the previous statements have executed correctly. In which case, in this case, statement 2 hasn't executed correctly. So statement 3 will be skipped. If there are subsequent statements in the try block, they will all be skipped. And what happens? I'm going to jump to the catch block and run statement 4. After the catch block statements, you can have multiple statements in the catch block, right? Move on to statement 5 and carry on. In this situation, the exception which was thrown by statement 2 has been successfully caught by the catch block, and hence the program carries on running. Alright, you have dealt with the error condition with the catch block, and hence the program carries on running. Okay, so if an exception occurs in the catch block, if an exception occurs in the try block, you will be caught in a catch block, and after that the program moves on. Alright, let's take a look at an example in the next lecture.